Philip, what are we going to see in 2019? Is it going to be more volatility on the markets, or are we going to see more of a shift to active management?
I think it's a year where we'll see a fair amount of volatility. It's marked by uncertainty because we are in a macro kind of global slowdown backdrop. And so you should expect a year that is, in a sense, difficult and challenging in every way for policymakers, for investors, for clients. This is not an easy year where beta carries the day, but will be a year where you have to really work to create a decent return.
And this, Philip, you think because of geopolitics, because markets are going to go through shifts, what will be the biggest shift this year? Is it going back to what we were saying? Is it monetary policy?
No, I think it's fundamentally, Francine, it's the question of whether we can get a soft landing in terms of the macro cycle, or whether we end up in a situation where we, get into a recession environment at some point in one of the major economies. I think that's the first sort of big question. And then if you look at the different regions, the main issue, the big question, the driving force will be how much of a slowdown are we going to see in China, or to what extent can China stabilize its growth outlook? Remember that China today is by far the most important growth contributor to the world. If you look at the last 5 years, China has accounted for 1/3 of global growth, whereas the U.S. has only been 1/5, and in fact, it's going to go to 1/10 going forward. So China is a key issue in terms of global risks.
Good governance, of course, is a top concern for BlackRock as a powerful shareholder. Has your view on the European banking sector changed at all with news of possible money laundering in some of the banks?
Look, this is a very difficult topic. I think the way I would frame it is that European banking is undergoing a very fundamental transition, and has been, frankly, for some years. You can see this in price-to-book ratios. You can see it in total return numbers relative to U.S. banks. Europe is in the midst of a painful transition that will likely take another couple of years, maybe several years, before it can re-emerge as an attractive place to invest. This is partly a function of the crisis, partly a function of flawed business models, and partly a function of the macro environment. But I think we have to brace ourselves for a difficult transition. Now, you can come out of this. We have seen this here in Switzerland, of course, around bank secrecy, tax evasion. That, too, was a very painful adjustment. But today, the Swiss banks have largely succeeded. So I think you can come through this. But I would expect it to entail significant changes in the way banks operate, in their business models, and it will take time.
Talk to me a little bit about ESGs. How can you, confidently build sustainability without funding things that actually are not sustainable at all? How many questions and actually, loopholes do you need to make sure that you close to invest in the right stuff?
It's a very good question, and you're right to point at this. I would say fundamentally this is a research problem. Now, the good news is that compared to 10, 15 years ago, today we have analytical tools, we have big data. There's an enormous amount of academic research that is going into this that, in fact, is beginning to reveal a story that is very promising, namely that you don't have to trade value for values. You don't lose performance. You don't have to sacrifice performance by incorporating sustainability factors, so-called ESG factors, into your investment offering. And that's a really big change, right? I think traditionally there was always a sense that if you wanted to do this because you believed in it, it reflected your values, you were going to sacrifice performance. What the research empirically is beginning to show, and we've just published a paper on this, the time series now is starting to be considerable, that is no longer the case, certainly not on a risk-adjusted basis. And that's really a very big game changer, which will produce, I'm convinced, significant demand, particularly here in Europe.